Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Greg Grandin?
This is he.
Hello, Greg. This is Paul Holdengräber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes. Thank you so much for taking my call.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure to speak to you. Tell me, where do I find you at the present time? How are you bearing this quarantine?
Well, we are upstate in the Hudson Valley and the Catskills, so it's pretty idyllic in some ways. So we're based in Brooklyn normally, but we came upstate, and so it's fairly far removed from some of the worst.
You're probably following some of the worst. I must begin by also congratulating you on your Pulitzer Prize win this year for The End of Myth: From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America. Congratulations to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's a line by Herman Melville that you've thought about a great deal, which I didn't know, and which I'd love you to unpack for us, where he says, seeking to conquer a larger liberty, man but extends the empire of necessity. Even from your remove now in the Catskills, what does that line mean to you at the present time?
Well, I read it as Melville uses it as an epigraph, and so did I. I used it for an epigraph in a previous book called The Empire of Necessity. And Melville uses an epigraph in one of his short stories, and he attributes it to an unpublished manuscript in his possession. And I think my understanding from Melville scholarship is that Melville scholars think that that was Melville's own gloss on Hegel, on Hegel's understanding of the relationship of freedom and necessity that we achieve, that human consciousness, that human beings move towards a greater freedom through the recognition of dependence or necessity on others. This was both Melville's gloss on Hegel and his critique of the United States, of a certain kind of definition of freedom that imagines freedom as an escape from dependence, as an escape from necessity, as an escape from social relations, and hence seeking to conquer a greater liberty, man but extends the empire of necessity. That every attempt to kind of break free just winds up creating new necessities, and this is a way of thinking about, and I think using Melville to think through a certain kind of American exceptionalism, that what's ultimately at the core of what we call American exceptionalism, a definition of freedom as freedom from restraint, rather than a recognition of mutual dependence with other human beings.
Do you feel that sentence resonates even more so now, and if so, how?
Well, I think that it resonates very clearly, and what we're seeing is kind of the unraveling of that what was a fairly coherent, and the coherence was created through the experience of the United States as an ever expanding nation or empire, but a certain definition of freedom as freedom from, as I mentioned, as freedom from restraint. And you see it in the kind of neurotic, hysterical protests against, against even the mildest social policy. I mean, we saw a preview of this with the Tea Party under Barack Obama, in which the most mildest attempt to deal with the collapse of the financial housing market and dealing with the catastrophic consequences of the Bush administration's unabated militarism in the Middle East, the reaction to Obama was the Tea Party, a kind of an expression of this in which any kind of government intervention, even the most mildest, centrist, corporate-friendly form, was understood as a form of slavery. And for me, it's kind of what is ultimately racialized about American notions of freedom, because this notion of freedom as freedom from restraint was forged in the social experience of expansion, and what that practically meant was the expansion of chattel slavery, the dispossession of Native Americans, war on Mexico, different regimes of racialized labor, be it chattel slavery, be it NAFTA, be it undocumented migrants and the dependency on them. And to go back to your question about do we see it today, the Tea Party was a preview of it, but we certainly see it in the reaction a couple of weeks ago to the mildest attempts to enforce some kind of public health policy and get people to stay in or get people to wear masks. These kind of Koch network funded protests, but even though they're kind of astroturf in the sense that they're funded by the money power, the ideology behind it, I think, resonates in American nationalism. It's been eclipsed, obviously, with the real protests of deep-seated anger and deep-seated immiseration and deep-seated exploitation and domination, as opposed to the imagined domination of these kind of, what would we call them? The kind of, sequels to the Tea Party that was protesting the COVID initiatives and prevention policies.
It's always extraordinary for me to speak to historians who have a long view. And your answer is so excellent. You tell a story, you tell an anecdote, a telling anecdote that I'd like you to tell our listeners because it's so excellent. I could say it, but I know you will tell it much better. This extraordinary story about Andrew Jackson in 1811 when he was transporting slaves and got stopped by a federal agent. I felt that story in a way encapsulates a lot of what people believe to be a certain kind of freedom.
Yeah, this was Andrew Jackson before he had made his name, before he was president, before he became a national name in the War of 1812, before he launched the destruction of the Creeks. He was a slave trader. He was a lawyer. He was a landowner based in Tennessee, around Nashville, and he's the only president that we know of that personally transported slaves. We know that many of the founders of the United States were slave owners, but Andrew Jackson personally transported slaves from the slave market to plantation, and he did so in coffles, the chains around the neck of enslaved peoples, and he was moving a shipment of enslaved people along a road from Nashville down to New Orleans, or actually in the other direction. And he was asked by a federal agent, and this went through an indigenous reservation, and he was asked by a federal agent. This was in 1811, so it was a few years after the abolition of the Atlantic slave market, not slavery in the United States. And so the slave trade was internal, and the federal government was trying to enforce some mild regulation of slavery, make sure that slaves weren't contraband, that they weren't illegally imported from Cuba. And so he was stopped by a federal agent and asked to see his documents proving that he was the owner, that the enslaved people were his rightful possession. And he flew into a rage, depending on who he spoke, who told the story. He either showed his guns or he pulled out a constitution and said, "This is the only passport I need." Because you need a passport to travel. And then in his letters to Washington, he clearly equated being asked to prove that he was the rightful owner of slaves with slavery itself. And this is the essence of a definition of freedom as freedom from restraint. The idea that any kind of regulation, even regulating the institution of slavery and human beings as property, is itself a violation of individual sovereignty. This is an extreme version, but certainly it resonates down that kind of bellicosity that we see in militia movements, the Tea Parties, but also, I think, more broadly broadcast throughout U.S. political culture. This idea of this intense beholden to individualism. Obviously, there's a sharpened edge of the knife manifested in these politicized right-wing movements, but I think it's also disseminated more broadly in political culture, a certain kind of freedom. And this is what I mean by a definition of freedom as freedom from restraint that denies the social basis of existence, the mutual interdependence, the fact that the smallest common denominator isn't one, but of human beings isn't one, but two. You need two people to make a human.
Looking at this moment now, from a historical perspective, do you see certain rights being taken away that might not be retrievable?
In what sense?
Well, it would seem that we're at a moment now where a lot of rights are in jeopardy, and to some extent also some of those rights that are in jeopardy, one can't really see those rights disappearing because there's kind of a sleight of hand moment where we're focused. That's why I always think it's interesting to speak to magicians, because things are happening in one realm while we're focused on another. And I think with your long view of history, you might be able to delineate some of them that are being threatened. Yeah.
Well, certainly, as you said, the sleight of hand, the magical sleight of hand, is to obsess about a certain kind of rights that is supposedly being trespassed upon, that fetishizes individualism, that fetishizes and holds as sacrosanct individual rights and sees as perverse social or economic rights. And it's certainly one of the ways in which I think that U.S. power blocks within the United States have diverted attention. When actually what is happening is that the real kind of trespass against individuals is in the realm of corporate control and monopoly, and the intense and incredible amalgamation of economic power, which becomes political power. Right. You saw some of these themes obviously raised in the Bernie Sanders campaign, but I think that's the realm in which a more fundamental notions of rights and justice is being contracted and trespassed on, even as a lot of the discourse is around more, the loss of individual freedoms. There's a confusion between state power and market power, and a lot of focus on the power of the state. But historically in the United States, it's been in the realm of private economic power that individuals have been subordinated and dominated, and that realm is often held up. That domination is often held up as legitimate when any attempts by the state to regulate that realm is understood as a form of tyranny.
Professor Grandin, bear with me for a moment. I want to read a quotation to you from Naomi Klein, which was on Democracy Now!, and I want you to react to it. She says, we often talk about governments like the Trump administration as governments that are committed to climate change denial. I don't think they deny the reality of climate change. Donald Trump has had to adapt the construction of his golf courses because of rising sea levels. They all know it's happening, but they think they're going to be all right. They think their families are going to be all right. They think the wealthier countries are going to be all right. And these governments are adapting to climate change. They may not be adapting the way the United Nations would like them to adapt, by cutting emissions, by building seawalls, whatever it is. They're building border walls. They are adapting through this unleashing of white supremacist ideology and creating the intellectual rationale for allowing millions of people to die. That's what I mean by climate barbarism. How do you react to that?
I think Naomi Klein's absolutely right. I think elsewhere she said something along the lines of the only thing that's scarier than a nativist right-wing movement that denies climate change or climate catastrophe is a nativist right-wing movement that accepts the reality of climate change. And I think ultimately that is what Donald Trump's administration and the broader movement that took him to power, Trumpism, represents. He's the first climate change politician. I mean, setting aside the economic interests in the fossil fuel industry and his commitment to reproducing that industry, I think what Trump represents is an acknowledgement that the premises of a previous universalism, and in some ways, Trump is just pointing out the contradictions and hypocrisy of the older order, right? The United States consumed and disposed of a vast majority, a disproportionate amount of the world's resources. So there was no earlier universal equality that Trump, is traducing. But I think that what Trump represents is a recognition that if the old liberal universalism was based on the premise, if not the actual practice, that there was formal equality, that constant growth meant that every nation could sit at the table, all boats would rise. Trumpism represents a more sober assessment of the fact that limits have been reached, that we live in a world of scarcity, and that we should organize nations along lines of domination that reflect that scarcity, where the old liberal order was based on a premise that ever expanding growth meant that you could at least pay lip service to the promise of equality and universalism. Trump is a more honest expression of the realities of power and domination. That said, it's tempting to think of Trumpism as a more honest reflection of how the world works, a brutal realism, but a realism nonetheless. I think Trumpism is its own form of enchantment. It's based on enchantment and mystification. It's based on the idea that all we have to do is build a wall and we can continue as we were. We can continue to burn coal. We can continue to torture. So therefore, all of these kind of expressions, that every kind of expression of not being told what to do, a certain kind of political petulance, becomes part of the culture war. No one's going to tell us, we're not going to submit to the Paris Accords. We're not going to know what we're going to pull out of the Geneva Convention. Nobody, where the old liberal order tortured, but they tortured under the table. Trump says we're just going to torture. We're going to bomb. We're going to torture. No one can tell us what to do. So it's based on a certain kind of idea that the world can, or at least the U.S. can continue to do what it's doing if we just build the wall. Obviously that is not the case. There is a real world out there with real limits. And COVID is just one expression of that.
While I was listening to you, I was both thinking about the Melville quotation and the Andrew Jackson anecdote, and feeling just how what you're describing as Trumpism fits so perfectly in both cases. I mean, just it's mind-boggling, and I'm wondering, both as a professor going back to teaching, I imagine this fall perhaps, will you go back to teaching in a different way, do you think? Will your assignments change? And another way for me to ask you this question, if you were the editor of a well-funded newspaper and overseeing that newsroom, What would you send your reporters to go investigate?
It's interesting to go back to the question, the division or the separation between realms of, state and public power and private realms of economic power in which most people experience domination and subordination. Cy Hirsch, a famous investigative reporter, he made his name investigating war crimes, crimes of state, crimes of public authority. He briefly tried to investigate corporate malfeasance and basically gave it up. He just didn't have any access to it compared to public documents, which allows for more revelation. So it's I like telling that story because he's probably the preeminent dogged investigative reporter that the U.S. produced, who revealed one transgression from My Lai to the bombing of Cambodia to onward. We can go on and on about of Cy Hirsch's contribution to public knowledge of state abuse. But when he confronted with trying to make that move into the corporate world, basically gave up. You just don't have access to it. So if I had unlimited resources, it would certainly be to investigate corporate power, because I think that is where the locus of authority and domination take place.
I had occasion to interview Cy Hirsch, and it was one of the most memorable moments I've had. Every question got a 20 or 25 minute answer, which was tremendous, cantankerous, and so deeply informed.
I know.
Your students, what are they going to be studying under your leadership when you go back to teaching?
This last semester, I was teaching a course on the history of the border wall. That's kind of the end point of my last book, the end of the myth, and so it was. I was more or less, the course was designed around many of the themes in the book, and then the pandemic happened, and in some ways it was an illustration of many of the through lines of the course in real time and acceleration. I mean, the contradiction of undocumented workers who were both hounded by ICE and Border Patrol and yet deemed essential workers. I mean, you can't get anything more illustrative of the paradox of freedom and necessity than that, right? And so the transition to online teaching and in that particular course went fairly well, because we were able to upscale from talking about these themes as they related to the history of the border and border wall to more on a global immediate scale. So I imagine that I'll design classes along those lines. I think there's a hunger for that kind of exposition.
Definitely. Will there be something new on the syllabus in the fall that you wouldn't have included were we not in this moment? Or is this something differently put? I'm asking you for a very short reading list of something that will help me understand this.
Well, certainly anything by Mike Davis. Davis, a premature catastrophist. I mean, the monster after the monster. I read City of Courts. I read Ecology of Fear, and I didn't really pay attention to his books talking about pandemic. So and then it's just remarkable how certainly Mike Davis, I think, it's his moment in many ways. Naomi Klein, as you mentioned, I think is invaluable. I haven't really thought about of what to include. I'm still, in many ways, kind of processing.
Right, of course.
What's happening, especially now, things are happening so fast. The way that they just 2 weeks ago, it was all of the protests against COVID restrictions, and how ludicrous they were, but how resonant they were with the U.S. political culture. And now all of a sudden we've, in the blink of an eye, we've entered this completely different moment.
You quote a line in closing of Martin Luther King from his Beyond Vietnam speech, where he says, there is such a thing as being too late. Is it too late? Are we too late?
Well,
And if we are
well,
too late, what are we too late for? Or what is there still time to do?
I think Martin Luther King represented he obviously was grounded in continental philosophy. I mean, obviously he was a theologian, but he was a Marxist, a Hegelian. He had a sense of the sweep of history, and he was obviously he was a Christian, but he was also an existentialist. You could certain kind of existentialism in Martin Luther King's philosophy and ethics that is appealing. We're always too late. I guess is the answer, but we're never too late. What's that great poem by Bertolt Brecht about? You could change. You could change the world in your last breath. I can't remember.
No,
exactly
I can't remember that poem by Brecht. I do remember.
It's wonderful.
I do remember so many of his, including the one, in these dark times will there be singing? Yes.
Yeah.
There will be singing about these dark times. What worries you the most, or if you prefer, what shard of hope do you have for what will come next?
Well, what worries me the most is how deeply ingrained white supremacy is and riddled through U.S. institutions and ideology. There's a hatred of, it goes beyond racism. There's been a lot of talk of Trumpism as a death cult, and I think that the dynamics that drive that death drive need to be specified. It goes back to some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier. This notion of freedom as freedom from restraint. If that is such a deeply ingrained element of one's worldview, then anything that reminds you of limits, and then the greatest restraint is the dependency that we talked about, the social existence of individualism.
Yeah.
But in the United States, that the core of that has been labor, cheap labor, racialized regimes of labor. So people of color are an unwanted recognition and acknowledgement of both limits and social dependency. And that, to me, that's at the essence of racialized capitalism and why it seems to be inescapable, why so much of public debate keeps coming back neurotically to race, even when the topic isn't explicitly about race, whether it be taxes or government regulation or healthcare. And that's the most depressing part, I think, and the most scariest part, how inescapable it is. The most hopeful part is obviously the protest and the rejection of it. This multi-class and transracial protest movement is really unique and powerful. Obviously, it's already changed the debate. Within less than a week's time.
And it makes me think of that Arundhati Roy is perhaps right when she was talking about the pandemic, but maybe it's also true about the moment we're living now, which is that it could be a portal. It could be an opening. It could be, and I try to resist the darker moments of Kafka's quotation when he says, "There's hope, but not for us." And which is always it's so wonderful of a quotation because it's so dark, and invariably it makes people laugh.
Yeah. Let's hope, but not for us. I know, and it's along those lines of that Brecht quote, like it's never too late. It's not.
We'll find that poem. We'll find that poem. We'll find that. You'll send it to me, or I'll send it to you, and we'll put it online so that everybody can read it. Thank you so much for taking my call, and let us be in touch. I hope we meet in person, and all the best to you and to your family. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for all your great work. It's a wonderful program, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, Go to dublab.com/support.